All right, today we are looking at early developments in the United States. So, kind of the tensions and issues that took place after the Constitution was created, the debates between the Federalists and Anti-Federalist, and then looking at just a few key points with the Adams presidency and Jefferson presidency. So the first thing that we're going to look at has to do with the Federalist and Anti-Federalist debates. The Constitution was created and had to go to the states to be ratified in order to be implemented. And as much as there was compromise that had to be done to create the Constitution, you also had disagreements about the Constitution itself and whether it was sufficient for the government or whether there needed to be additional components added. And so this split into two groups. The Federalists were considered to be the strong supporters of the Constitution. So they were the ones that provided, or what they saw as the Constitution, not only as a good document, but actively pushing for it to be ratified. The main kind of a group that ends up writing the Federalist Papers, which were defenses for the Constitution under the pseudonym Pluvius, were Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. Hamilton by far was the most energetic and ardent of the three. They all set out initially to write generally equal amounts of papers, which they then sent to various newspapers to get published. And so these were called like essays and stuff with that. So here we'll put the authors right under the pseudonym Pluvius. And they the goal of these essays was to get wide support with the public, and ideally then with the states that were going to ratify the Constitution. The Alexander Hamilton, he wrote the majority of these papers. So again, they initially set out to kind of write equal amounts, but Alexander Hamilton was always known for being super verbose. He wrote a ton, and also spoke at length. And there's a good scene in the play Hamilton where he has his conflict with Aaron Burr, and they're writing letters back to each other, and Aaron Burr gets one of his letters, and it goes on, and he just looks at it incredulously because it was like multiple pages of listing out all of the disagreements they had had over the years, going back to when they first met, and it was super detailed and so long, and that was kind of Hamilton's way to be super verbose. So he wrote a ton of these, and the purpose was to gain support, highlight the virtues of the Constitution, and just in general talk it up so that it would get passed, right? That was the ultimate goal, is that it would be ratified. And their main argument, in part because their argument was responding to the Anti-Federalists, which we'll look at, was that the Constitution, well, two parts. One was the strong centralized government, right? Because the whole point of the Articles of Confederation was the fear of a strong centralized government. And now you had this Constitution being sent out that completely over-ended the Articles of Confederation, and did exactly what they were afraid of. And so the main arguments they put out within these papers, especially Madison, but also Alexander Hamilton, was the strong centralized government was a source of stability, right? It was a good thing. It wasn't something to be feared. It was something that was necessary to cause stability and security for this new nation. And so, right, instead of not a weakness, but a strength. Because there definitely was that idea that this was a bad thing. The other issue that they tackled was this concern that a strong centralized government would become tyrannical, right? Like the monarchy, right? Just look at the British government. That went horrible. We had the king was a tyrant, or a strong centralized government was naturally going to devolve into despotism. That was their kind of favorite catchword: tyranny and despotism. And so one of the main arguments that they made, besides that it was a source of stability, is that that there was enough checks and balances in the new system with the Constitution to protect everyone's interest and prevent a single, not just leader, but a single government or faction from becoming tyrannical or becoming a despot, right? And so they did very much address those fears of that, and then definitely the checks and balances was a huge thing. It's going to be one of the arguments when they push back against the Bill of Rights initially, is that you don't need a check and balance, you don't need the Bill of Rights, because the checks and balances in the Constitution make sure that the rights of the individual will be secure, right? So you can trust the Constitution to know that that those rights are protected. So those were kind of the main arguments that they made, and they were way more organized than the Anti-Federalist, and so that helped with just the breadth of and depth of what they were able to get out there. So their message was definitely more common and more well read. And again, that has in part to do with the fact of how many papers were ultimately published and written, and largely thanks to Alexander Hamilton. John Jay and Madison didn't write anything close to what Alexander Hamilton did in terms of essays. And then they had, besides those three men that were writing the essays under the pseudonym Pluvius, you had others that were in support with the Federalists, and they helped organize this whole push to make sure that the Constitution was passed. The other group, the Anti-Federalist, which they ended up getting their name coined by the Federalists intentionally to sound negative, right, with the whole anti. So there was also some, not trickery, but definitely some propaganda and knowing how PR would be there. That's a good word for it. There was definitely some PR by the Federalists and trying to make the opposition seem as if they were just negative individuals who were just criticizing whatever and were against the government as a whole. Ultimately they aren't going to have the strongest position, but they're going to still be instrumental in making sure that a Bill of Rights gets added to the Constitution. Without the Anti-Federalists, that probably wouldn't have happened. So their name was created or set by the Federalist, we'll say in an attempt to put them not only in a negative light, but also on the defensive. So in that sense, like I said, it was pretty clever PR. So their main concern was that the Constitution shifted the balance between liberty and power too much in the direction of power. Right? So they were much more proponents of the Articles of Confederation. At least the idea. Not necessarily. Almost everyone agreed that the Articles of Confederation was not working, and that needed to be restructured. And so that wasn't really the issue, that they were like, no, we want to go back to the Articles of Confederation. But that they liked the idea of an idea of a confederation of states, rather than a strong centralized government. And their main argument had to do with this idea of the fear that if you gave a centralized state too much power, that it ultimately would come to abuse it. And specifically, not only be abused, but the minority by the majority against the minority. And what they saw as what would become, not necessarily that it already was, but they argued that the majority would end up being merchants, creditors, and other forces who would end up controlling the government. And of course, they weren't going to have the best interest of the people in mind, right? It was all going to be about money and power, and that this ultimately was hostile to ordinary Americans' interest. And for some, that was seen, they saw Alexander Hamilton as the epitome of that, especially as he got into Secretary of Treasury and was trying to create a national bank, and his policies, they ended up pointing to that and saying, look, this is exactly what we talked about was problematic, and this is not, this is only benefiting those within that realm of businesses and banks and things like, and creditors and things like that. And so then their other argument was that, of course, so if the too much power and too much centralized government was a bad thing, then instead popular self-government, and popular self-government meaning in terms of the population voting and stuff, flourished best in small communities, not in a large federal, not communications here, communities, and where the rulers and ruled interacted, which is very much the argument that was used with Britain and taxation without representation. That you needed someone who not only knew the people, but would specifically be impacted by whatever decisions were made. And then their other argument, which you could argue today was definitely something that is true, is that if centralized, put that here, if strong centralized government was created, that only the wealthy and only the select men of wealth and resources would be able to be elected. And so this left out pretty much everyone else in participating in the government, which was the whole point, was that more people would be able to participate in this popular self-government. So would be able to be elected to national government. Of course, they weren't talking about the states and things like that, but that essentially a strong centralized government was exclusionary, and that was problematic. They also they tried to connect to Revolutionary War ideas. Again, this was popular. You see this over and over again in society, that this was a very popular thing to do because of the popularity and support of the Revolutionary War. Liberty was their catchphrase. The importance of liberty, the importance of maintaining liberty and preventing that from being taken away, and that a limited government was what protected liberty. And then the other thing that they connected to that idea of liberty was a Bill of Rights. The Constitution did not have a Bill of Rights when it was first created. Right, so no Bill of Rights we'll say at the start, and they pointed to use the states as examples, and said, all of the states had a Bill of Rights, and some were pretty extensive. There were some states that had hundreds for their list of Bill of Rights. And so they said, obviously, the states find it important enough to have a Bill of Rights, because they understand that the whole point is that the Bill of Rights is there to protect what was basically the unalienable rights that the Declaration of Independence had talked about. And they said that if you don't have, without a Bill of Rights, it allows the government to take away your liberty, right? You aren't protected, essentially. And in many ways, they were right. If you look at what is most discussed in the Constitution today, even, it's the Bill of Rights, right? Those first amendments, the very first amendments of the Constitution are the Bill of Rights. And the reason they're amendments is because the Constitution gets ratified, but there's still a lot of issues, and so as part of the compromise, James Madison and others agreed to write up the first amendments, which would be considered the Bill of Rights. But if you're looking at everything that's cited in the Constitution, people don't cite the other articles of the Constitution very often. What people cite and know about the Constitution is the Bill of Rights, and it's time and time again what comes up in court cases to ask or push or use to show what Americans have as rights and how those are protected. So imagine not having those in the Constitution, and how that might be extremely different, what the government could do and what laws they can enact. They are extremely important. That just was a necessity. And eventually, so this is the Anti-Federalists did not win in pushing against the Constitution. It ended up being ratified. Where they were important and successful was getting the Bill of Rights. And so they were able to press the need. And the reality is that most Americans believed that a Bill of Rights was important because obviously, like I said, it was already part of the general public's understanding of government because it was in the state constitutions. And so you didn't have you had to push back with the Federalists. Like the Federalists, and again, James Madison was initially that, but in order to essentially keep the peace and make an agreement, Madison agreed to work and write the Bill of Rights, essentially. But the Federalists had said that you didn't need it. And in fact, you had Federalists who basically argued that it was redundant. A Bill of Rights would be redundant because the Constitution provided so many checks and balances that there was no possible way that an individual could take enough power and completely deprive people of their rights, which is obviously completely not true. The checks and balances work sometimes, and sometimes they don't. When you have a government and enough people in it that don't care to follow the laws and the principles of the Constitution, they become permissive of allowing certain people in power to ignore the Constitution. I mean, and that's ultimately the problem. If you don't have enough of a group that allows, like, the president or others to just completely ignore the Constitution, then yeah, there are checks and balances that can prevent that. But if you have a big enough body that is willing to overlook that stuff, then there aren't enough checks and balances, and that's where the Bill of Rights comes in. So with the Constitution already ratified, what this discussion would happen is that Madison then ultimately presented Congress with the first amendments to the Constitution. And then that is where you get the Bill of Rights. And that was passed, again, because there wasn't really, even those who tried to argue the Constitution enough, weren't against it enough to push back against it, essentially. So that was the big fight, but it was a big fight. Like, this whole thing, not the Bill of Rights, but the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. There was serious tension between those two groups, and that's going to remain. So one of the consequences of this was that once you had the government set up and the first positions elected, which of course George Washington was elected as president, overwhelmingly supported as president, and then you had the different positions like Alexander Hamilton was appointed as Secretary of Treasury, Thomas Jefferson Secretary of State. Then you see the consequence of this Federalist, Anti-Federalist issues when they were supporting the Constitution, because you really get a strong, almost from the beginning, partisan split between these two groups, right? And so while we'll say the Constitution and Bill of Rights was adopted, right, it didn't stop the tensions between the two groups. Didn't stop. Because then you still, so now you have to run a government, right? And then the core argument becomes within running the government of how strong, because you can still make decisions within the government. If you have a strong centralized government, how strong of centralized policies are you going to do? And so you can have this Constitution that allows for strong centralized governments, but it doesn't mean that the people running it are going to utilize all those to their full and total process. And so with George Washington as president, he had some specific views on this, which kind of shaped the Federalist control in the beginning, right? So he was the first president. He ran for 2 terms and was encouraged to run for a 3rd term. There was no rule. In fact, that rule doesn't get put into place until much later, when they were feared that a different president was going to try to run for more than 2 terms. So we have that rule now, but that rule was not in the Constitution at the beginning. So there was nothing to stop George Washington from running for a 3rd term. And he was strongly supported by many people. He kind of was that a bridge between the Federalist and Anti-Federalist, even though he tended to sway more towards stronger centralized government and control. He had the respect of both sides, and it's unlikely that anyone, at least for a 3rd term, would have won against him if he had chose to run. But he decided that as president that he shouldn't run for a 3rd term, because he didn't think that a president should be president for so long that it started to look like a kingship, and wanted it to be a system where you had a kind of set time where then it shifted over to a new leadership. So we really do owe his decision, which was completely voluntary and not required by any law, to set the example of presidents stepping down after 2 terms, which, again, subsequent presidents followed until there became concern much later that a president wouldn't. And then Congress put into law that you couldn't do more than 2 terms because of that fear. But the fact that so many presidents followed that precedent that George Washington set up, even though there was no legal basis for it, shows how much he kind of shaped early ideas of the American government, and that people respected his decisions to follow suit. Because, again, not everyone believed that it was necessary. Most didn't think a president should run for life, or that it should be a guaranteed life position, like Alexander Hamilton had suggested in the Constitutional Convention. Not just that they could run for life, but that it should be a lifetime position was what he argued. Almost no one agreed with that. But for how long, there definitely was, like I said, there wasn't a huge pushback. I doubt there would have been much protest at all if George Washington had gone for another term. So that we definitely owe that to him, because it set that up. But one of his other things was that Washington did not believe. He did not think there should be political parties. He didn't like that idea. He believed that it would be divisive to the Constitution, to the American people, to the government all around, which you could also argue is right, or certainly you could argue that it's correct. It is divisive when it's just a strong 2-party system, and it's almost impossible for a 3rd-party system to be successful. It does become divisive because you end up getting set into these 2 camps that are anti each other, rather than having multiple parties that are on various levels of the spectrum. It's on opposite sides. You have this dichotomy between one party and the other, rather than them being more unified, or multiple parties where you can have this kind of happy moderate medium, or various degrees of that. There is also a problem if you have too many political parties, right? So the solution is just not to have hundreds of political parties. That becomes its own problem. But it's hard to have a 3-party system once you have a 2-party system super entrenched, as we have seen throughout history, that a 3rd-party system rarely gains in popularity. And even once it does, when you do have these rare moments where a 3rd party gains in popularity and looks like it has potential, it's not successful enough to get them to be president. It would have to move at the lower levels and gain much more traction within the state legislature and the Congress. And maybe if you had a ton of third-party candidates where they became the majority, not like different third-party candidates, but a single third-party candidate that kind of became the majority, then they might have a chance in the presidency. But until you kind of inundate those lower levels, a third-party candidate rarely has a shot at the presidency logistically because of the two other powerhouses that developed. And this developed very early on. This is not a modern-day problem. This became a problem that was already developing when George Washington was president, and with his stepping down, immediately became solidified. So it was almost like because he didn't approve of it, even though they were there, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalist were already there, he kind of held them back a little bit. As soon as he stepped down, you have a kind of all-out war in many cases between these two groups that very much fought and argued and printed negative stories about each other. Like, we talk about the like toxic nature of political parties or running elections. Back then they would write false stories about each other, scandalous stories, made up stuff, some true, some made up, and they would print them in the newspapers. And the newspapers didn't really care to look into whether it was truthful or not. And so you would have these scathing personal attacks. So the whole, like, yes, you'd argue it's still bad today, but personal attacks during elections, started with Adams and Jefferson and continued on. Alexander Hamilton was a master at destroying people in the press. And so that wasn't a new thing by any means that way. So didn't believe that there should be political parties. And he eventually, though, did support a strong national government. He believed that it worked better. So while he was not a Federalist in the sense of being part of that, he did, that was his viewpoint skewed that way. But again, he hated the idea of specific political parties. So he pushed against, designating himself as one or the other because he didn't think that was a good idea. And technically, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists weren't initially political parties. Again, it's kind of with the end of George Washington's presidency that they solidify into specific political parties. They were just viewpoints and groups that then shifted into that. All of this happens, though, is that because he tended to support a strong national government, he also didn't like the idea of getting involved in political squabbles or debates. You had discussions, but he argued the president should be kind of above that stuff, is that all of this allowed Alexander Hamilton to have a very strong voice and control in shaping the government and policies during George Washington's presidency. So voice and control, we'll say, like I said, in shaping policy. It also probably helped that, he had been George Washington's secretary and really close. The song is appropriate, right-hand man, from the musical Hamilton during the war, and was trusted. Alexander Hamilton had been crucial in parts of the Continental Army being successful, and helped George Washington immensely, and he trusted Alexander Hamilton. So that helped too. But that, coupled with his unwillingness to kind of jump into the foray of debate and discussion and squabbling, meant that Alexander Hamilton kind of got a large control over policy structure and shape, and Washington tended to back Hamilton's policies because he trusted him. So with this, then Alexander's policies were centered around this idea. Well, one, the Founding Fathers, remember, believed the elite were really the ones that were going to be running the government, not the uneducated. In fact, if you didn't own land and have a certain amount of wealth, you couldn't even vote even as a white man, you could not vote in the early government structure. It was definitely designed. There was a belief that the poor were uneducated and incapable of being responsible with their voting. You needed to be educated. You needed to at least at the bare minimum, you needed to be well educated to make rational and good choices in your voting. Hamilton went farther than that. So let's put that, because he did believe that. So with that belief of general structure, right, needed to be well educated to be a responsible voter, and that this also then ties into only white men of, we'll say, wealth and property, which then included education, were allowed to vote. So we were not a full democracy. I mean, we weren't anyways if you count all the minorities, women, and any free black person, any Native American person, any whoever else. They obviously were excluded from voting for a long time. But even if you just say a democracy for white men, it wasn't even a full democracy for white men, because the poor were not included in that vote. And it takes till Andrew Jackson for what's called the democratization of America. But again, the democratization of America for white men, because that still didn't include anyone else. But under Andrew Jackson's presidency, that was the first vote for president where almost all white men could vote, and it didn't matter your status of wealth and education anymore. And so that was a brand new thing. It helped Andrew Jackson get into his position, because you had a whole new deluge of voters that had not been able to vote up to that point. So it was very limited in who could vote for positions. But besides the education part, Alexander Hamilton believed that the elite needed to have, they needed to be invested if they were going to be responsible for the government. And he saw that invested as an economic thing. That if they were not economically invested into the government, then they wouldn't have anything tying them to it. And if you wanted them to make the best possible choices for the government, for America, then you needed that kind of buy-in. And so this went into two things. He proposed a large and permanent national debt, which many people were very much against. National debt. And then the idea is with this national debt, you would have new bonds where it would be constantly issued as old bonds were paid off, so that there was always debt. And then the idea is that wealthy people, the elite, would buy into these bonds, so that their financial success was tied to the United States' financial success. Would buy into these bonds, right? So if they bought into bonds that were tied, so in order for them to make money and sell their bonds and gain interest and make money, the United States had to be doing well. And so if you had that direct interest, right, that this would create, it would, what he saw it as is entice the wealthy to have a permanent stake in seeing the government survive. And while some people saw this as a good idea, many did not like it, in part because they didn't want their wealth to be tied to the economic success of the government. And others just that they didn't like the idea of permanent national debt. But so it was a combination of that. He also wanted to create a national bank, which also was not seen. This was just seen as more federal strength and control that the government would have economically over people. Right? He saw the national bank would be able to provide loans and currency to specifically more to businesses than people. It wasn't necessarily for the people. It would also give the government a specific control and place to deposit federal funds and facilitate the collection of taxes and make it easier, which the national bank would make the collection of taxes easier. So a place to there's logic in it in the sense of, okay, if we're getting money from taxes and federal funds are coming in, it makes sense to not be tied to random banks that could go under or have their own agenda. Instead, if you had this national bank, then all of the government's financial dealings could be done there. It also makes sure that they're not getting ripped off in that process, and makes the whole economic and financial component easier. And then he also wanted to go along with this new taxes, additional taxes to bolster the revenue of the federal government, right? Because now with the new Constitution, the government can, for the first time, actually require taxes. Of course, taxes are still not popular for the people, and that was very much disliked, whether more than his national bank and bonds, all of it was disliked by the Republicans, the Anti-Federalists who become the Republicans, right? That's one of the things that's going to shift really soon, is that the Anti-Federalists will become the Republican Party, and then you'll still have the Federalist Party and the Republican Party. But so he got pushback through all of this. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison actually became his two biggest opponents. They didn't like what he was doing. They felt that all of his choices were only benefiting certain parts of the North, and the economic, Secretary of Treasury and his department, and they were unnecessary, and felt that it was too overreaching. That they didn't like the idea of the government having any kind of reach into their money. Or their money being tied to the government. And they certainly weren't a fan. Most people weren't fans of the taxes still. Too close to the Revolutionary War. And people still don't like taxes today, but there was definitely this ardent dislike of taxes, I think far more than anything today, because it was so closely connected to all the ideology of the Revolutionary War. Okay, the next thing is going to be with John Adams, and as George Washington decides to step down. So what we're going to talk about here with the Quasi-War with France, and this is during John Adams' presidency. So John Adams becomes the second president, and he ran. Thomas Jefferson ran as well for president, and here we'll put it here. How it worked back then is that the second runner-up for president became vice president. So John Adams won, not by a lot. He won, but it wasn't a massive margin. And Thomas Jefferson was the runner-up, so he became vice president. Why the Quasi-War with France? So right after the Revolutionary War, we were actually more closely aligned with France than we were with Britain, because the whole British and the Revolutionary War. We liked France. This deteriorates because of the French Revolution. So let's see, we'll put U.S. relations decline with France and improve with the British. Right, because we're closer with the British than we are with France, and end up long-term kind of being that way. But it wasn't at the start because of the whole Revolutionary War. So one of the tensions that creates this was the French Revolution. The French helped us out during our revolution, and because of we'll put the American Revolution and aid, this led to favorable treaties. In fact, they were a favored nation initially, where you had really good deals with treaties and things like that. And there was kind of an understanding by some, not the king, right? Because when the French government helped out officially the French or the American Revolution, the king, there was still a king of France. But several of the earlier players, like Lafayette, had helped with the hope of, we'll say hope by some French, that they might, that if they had a revolution to get rid of the king, right, that the Americans would help out. So it wasn't a requirement or a precondition of their aid, but this kind of belief that, hey, we helped you out in the American Revolution, and you guys, these were your ideals. Now we're beginning, once the French Revolution began to start, they're saying we're following in your footsteps. So your turn to help us out. And we had kind of said before that we would help them out. Hey, hey buddy, if you ever have your own revolution, count us in. We're good friends, best buds. And to show how close this connection was with France, I mean, you can say favored treaties, but that doesn't really mean a lot in kind of understanding how close we were to the French. Thomas Jefferson helped write the French Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which was like their it wasn't a Declaration of Independence in the same way, but he helped write the Declaration. We'll say French, just so it's clear. The name is only French, but just that way you're connecting it to it. So he helped write French Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. And if you read the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, it definitely has connections to the Declaration of Independence. But it also, and it has a lot of Enlightenment thought, but you can definitely see Thomas Jefferson's influence in the writing, because he helped them write it. One of the things is that in the original Declaration of Independence, the unalienable rights were life, liberty, and property. Property became contested because there was an argument that you couldn't guarantee that right. Well, and so we switched property to the pursuit of happiness. In the Declarations of Rights of Man and Citizen, there is a thing in there talking about the rights of property. So he got it in there. So Thomas Jefferson was key in helping with the early stages of the Revolution, and many people were very supportive of the French. Thomas Jefferson was by far one of the strongest French supporters. But many were in favor of it. Plus, you had that past history that they'd helped out with our revolution. We had said we would help them with the revolution. you know, over drinks. You know, one day when you have your revolution, we'll be there. And the French kind of believed that we would. And so much so, when they overthrew the king, and the French Revolution was chaos, by the way. It was for different reasons. The American Revolution was not for social change. Okay, that's something, and I mentioned that during the Revolutionary War lecture, but I want to re-emphasize that. The Revolutionary War, the American Revolutionary War, was not about social change. There was no social revolution. The leaders of the revolution, of the Sons of Liberty, the founding fathers, the Revolutionary War leaders, like John Adams, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, etc., most of them did not want social change. A few of them, you know, advocated for small changes. There were a few that were against slavery, but by and large, they weren't looking for an upheaval of social revolution. They were the elite of society. They were the wealthy. They were the white men in control, and they didn't want that to change. And you see that with the letter from Abigail Adams to John Adams, and the fact that he says all of these groups, you know, pushing for change, you know, why, this is just ridiculous. And so not okay. We will fight against this. They didn't want social change. They wanted political change. The American Revolution was, here, we'll just put the difference here. The American Revolution was about political change. We got rid of a king and set up a constitutional democratic republic. We call it democracy, right? But if you're looking at official terms of what's a democracy, that would require everyone's vote to count, and also everyone having equal opportunity to participate in running the government. If you want to look at a true democracy, look at Athens in ancient Greece, when they shift to a democratic society after Cleisthenes, a tyrant who takes over and reforms the archaic style of government and makes it what it is. Every person was drawn by lot to be in the government each year. So every year, your name essentially went into a hat. It wasn't a hat, but like your name went into the lottery, into a hat, and they drew out names. And you had the Council of 500, and those citizens would be in the council. They were randomly drawn by lot. They were there for a year, and then from the Council of 500, everyone's name went in of those 500, and they drew out 50 to be what were called prytanes, which were like magistrates who made the laws and did the day-to-day stuff. And then from the prytanes, you had a rotating person in charge from that 50. So it was 500, 50, and 1, and that was all from that group, right? And then everyone could be in the General Assembly to vote yes or no on stuff. All male citizens, of course. Women are never included in any of this stuff. And your vote counted 1-to-1, and everyone had equal. It didn't matter. There were no restrictions. You could be a beggar on the street, and then have the day to find out government positions, and end up being a major contributor to running the government for a year. And there were benefits and downsides to that, but that's true full democracy. We have democratic elements, which we looked at with the popular vote, but we also have representatives with the electors and other positions in Congress representing us and things like that too. And not everything is by popular vote. So we're not, like, so we're a representative. We have a constitutional representative or a constitutional democratic republic. Representative republic. It's a lot of words. If you're being really official, it has all of those things. Constitutional, representative democratic republic. That's the official term, right? But it still was political change. It was radical that the belief that the king didn't have hereditary right by God to rule and do what he wanted, and that the government was should only have the power because of the consent of the governed, right? Those were Enlightenment ideals, and that was radical political change and thinking. So that was a huge shift. The French Revolution had two parts to it. you start actually with number one was social change. And as problems emerged with that, they didn't actually want to get rid of the king. When the French Revolution started, they weren't looking to overthrow the king. What they wanted was better social representation for the lowest group, which was the majority of people, and they wanted a constitutional monarchy. So they weren't looking to overthrow the king at all. They just France was an absolute monarchy. Right, so they went from absolute monarchy. Oops. There we go. Absolute monarchy to they wanted constitutional monarchy, where the king which is what England was, which is that the king had some restrictions and it protected people's rights better, to a republic, to a radical structure, to Napoleon, which was then a dictator who called himself an emperor. Right, so you look at how many they had a lot of political changes, and that was the whole thing with the French Revolution was just that it was messy. It was chaotic, and it had a lot of civil unrest because it was social change, right? I listed these as political change, but those early years were also social change, and so there was a lot of riots. And there was a lot of protest and rioting with the population, even when they were just shifting it to constitutional monarchy. But that fighting never ended. The French Revolution was tied around all of this constant fighting, whether it was infighting and them killing each other. In the radical period, you had the Reign of Terror, where hundreds of thousands of people were executed for being seditious against the government. And the radical, it was not more liberal. It was much more conservative. And it was almost like a despot and ruling, or oligarchy. It was a rule of few. And then Napoleon ends up with a dictator. And then it goes back to monarchy, by the way. After constitutional monarchy. After Napoleon is defeated, they reinstate a king with a constitution. So, right, that's chaotic. Look at that whole list. But that's important to note, right? The French Revolution was both social change and political change. And one of the things that happens is that when they start having these changes, right, the French ask for American help, especially after they overthrow the king, and then they behead the king, right? So in the transition from constitutional monarchy to republic, they behead their king. They don't just depose him. They kill him. The guillotine was a new thing that was developed and seen as a more efficient and less cruel method of execution, which it was. It was faster and quicker than hanging and burning to death or torture or anything like that. And so they used the guillotine on the king and queen after. That wasn't right away. It wasn't their first thing that happened or their first choice. There was a bunch of things that King Louis did that kind of led him to that. He made very poor choices. He could have been a king of a constitutional monarchy if he would have just supported it. And so they end up being beheaded. And then you, like I said, you have an initial republic that quickly shifts into this very radical system where then they're all turning on each other anyway. They ask for help after the king is executed. Actually, while they're fighting against the king, and then again when the king is executed. And many in the United States were weary of that, not because they necessarily killed the king, but because of the riots, because of the social change that was very much not what the U.S. had wanted. And so the United States, Thomas Jefferson pushed for us to go help, right? He had helped write the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, and he said, we owe them. They helped us win the Revolutionary War at the end, and we said we'd help them. Why are we not trying to support this idea of democracy around the world? And Alexander Hamilton and others pushed back, saying, if we're not in the best shape, we're still a very new government, and if we start getting involved in foreign wars and conflicts, where is it going to stop? We're going to end up, jumping in all over the place, and that's going to leave us in a weakened state. Plus, right, they don't have a clear-cut direction. There's riots, it's social change. So the United States, George Washington ended up agreeing with that policy. So the United States basically said, nope, sorry. And this pissed off the French, because they're like, what the hell? We helped you, and now you're saying no. And this, along with some trade disagreements, led to deteriorating conditions between them. And then when things started to deteriorate between the French, then the British kind of came in and were like, ooh, hello. Well, we can be friends now, because of course there were benefits to be connected to the United States with all the conflict between the British and the French, and Europe in general could give you a leg up potentially. So there was a benefit, even if we were still not like a powerhouse at this point by any means. Anyway, so you have this deteriorating relationship with the French, and us getting closer to the British. So during their conflict and the period of revolution, the French begin seizing American ships and imprisoning the crews. So they had said that, we were in their area and space, and that that violated their territory. So what happens with this is that Charles Pickney, or Pinkney, however you say his name, was sent over as the American ambassador. Well, however, when he got there, the French refused to receive him. They said that he was not an official delegate. So what happens is Adams sends over what he called bipartisan commission. So it wouldn't be one, like, Federalist or Anti-Federalist, to meet with them to try to come to some resolution. So they send him over to Paris. What happens in this meeting is that the French minister, once they get there, first demands a loan for France, saying, we helped you out economically, you need to give us a loan, and on top of that, wanted a bribe for French officials before they even began to negotiate. So, right, first they're rude to Charles, who was sent over, and then immediately then say, not only do you have to give us a loan, but a bribe in order to go anywhere with this. So what ends up happening is that the report of the meeting is going to go to Congress. That was part of the rules. Is delivered to Congress and exchanges the names of the French officials in it, so that he doesn't name them, with X, Y, and Z, right? So just generic. They were just person X, person Y, person Z. Well, what happens with this ends up being called the XYZ affair because of that title. But not surprisingly, there was widespread outrage at France, and this specifically led to the Quasi-War with France, because they called it unacceptable, and we should not stand for that, which was from 1798 to 99. It wasn't long. Let's see where we're going with that. We'll go with 2 here. So with the war, right, we cut off trade with France. So the Quasi-War, we didn't go and fight in France or anything like that, and they didn't send troops to us, but that's why it's a Quasi-War. We cut off trade with France and authorized American vessels to capture French ships. And any of the battle or fighting happened in the ocean, in the seas with the ships. One of the things that this led to, though, in order to have a better chance, I suppose, with capturing the ships and everything like that, is that in order to be more successful with this, they created the Department of the Navy. We didn't have a strong naval presence before this at all. We also began constructing more modern warships. And this created even a closer relationship with Britain, because they were like, oh, perfect, we can use this to our advantage, so much so that they taught us, what helped us with the Navy, right? The British was like the Navy of that time, and the British provided ammunition for the ships, officers to train Americans on, to train American crews, right? So we basically got the best training from the best Navy in the area. They also taught us signaling communications, right? So you don't have radios at this point. So how do the ships communicate, over distance? I mean, it had to be visual. Communications. So they taught us their communications, and so that we could communicate with the British. But it was it was like a secret. It was a big deal to do. So they used flags and different colored flags, and how you held up and raised different flags, and actually raised flags on the ship meant different signals. And so that was a way to communicate and organize the ships and work together. So some significant things that came out of the Quasi-War with France. It ultimately was just, like I said, naval skirmishes. No full-time war or soldiers or anything like that. After this happened with the British, where they started teaching us all this stuff and we were developing a larger Navy, they realized the dangerous situation it was putting them in to be against both the Americans and the British. And so ultimately, this led to a new French government, or a commission sent to Paris in 1800, which was now under a new government with Napoleon, and this agreed to a peace treaty. So eventually, we'll say France realized they were not, we'll say, in a good position because of our alliance with the British, and agreed to peace in 1800 under Napoleon. So it was a short quasi-war. Nonetheless, it did have some significant impacts on our shifting allegiance to the British, and the Department of Navy, naval warfare, and development that way. The other thing under the Adams presidency was the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were an early test of the Bill of Rights, really. So the Alien and Sedition Acts were implemented because the Federalists were looking to, they wanted to strengthen their control and power against the Republicans. And there were two parts to it, obviously, the Alien Act and the Sedition Act. Their control power against Republicans. So the first, the Alien Act, this targeted foreigners, and essentially placed obstacles against foreigners who wanted to become American citizens. This that was pretty straightforward. The one that was more targeted towards the Republicans, although part of the Alien Act was seen as foreigners who supported Republican ideas, but the one that was definitely targeted directly at Republicans was the Sedition Acts. This specifically allowed the government, put that there, to prosecute anyone who is deemed involved in subversive activities against the government. And how, this was set up, right? The idea of prosecuting anyone who was subversive or deemed to be subversive in general theory, what didn't have a lot of people protesting against, if you were truly subversive, right? The problem came from the fact of the definition of subversive. Right, so if you're just saying, oh, someone who's trying to overthrow the government, people were like, okay, yeah, that's understandable, right? But the thing is that the definition in this act of subversive activities was very broad and vague. And the problem with that, let's see, so it was broad and vague. So the problem is if you don't have a clear-cut definition or list of this is what we mean by subversive, is it gave complete control to the government to define subversive. And this led to pretty much anything and anyone that was in opposition to the government, which is not subversive to just be in opposition to the government, to be against, what they're saying. That ultimately is a problem. And this spread to specifically newspapers and anything printed that was critical of the government, which of course then that brings in a whole other issue of amendment rights of freedom of speech, right? It went against the Bill of Rights. Right, this was really the first test of the Bill of Rights. And this is where then, of course, people had issue, was that it was, for ridiculous things. Essentially what the Sedition Act was saying is that you can't criticize the government at all. If you say anything negative about the government, then you could be charged as subversive. And you had newspaper editors who their only crime was criticizing the Federalist government, and it was targeted at Republicans who spoke critically against the Federalists. 10 men were charged with this act. And like I said, largely those that were charged were newspaper editors. This not only brought up the freedom of expression, Thomas Jefferson and Madison were against it and moved to block it. And ultimately, we'll just put it here, this caused further tensions, obviously, between the Federalists and the Republicans. And was seen, rightly so, as completely unconstitutional by many people. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is the transition to Jefferson, the election of 1800, and the Jefferson in power. We'll look at Jefferson first, and we'll talk about the midnight appointments. So the election of 1800 was Jefferson versus Adams. This time, Jefferson wins, and he becomes president. In part because Hamilton ends up backing him to get the nomination for between Aaron Burr was involved in who was going to be in power, and Jefferson ends up getting supported by Hamilton, which sways some people to support him this way. The consequence of this is, with Jefferson winning the presidency, Republicans largely replace the Federalist dominated government that had been in play and in power since the start of the Constitution. Let's see. So at the time, you're looking at kind of what was going on during this time and the structure. You have the city of Washington, and the general envisionment, if you will, of Washington is Americans, I'll say, hoped or wanted because it certainly wasn't. So they hoped or wanted Washington to be the American Paris, right? There was this envision that it would be this grand place of refinery and development. But the reality was, it was more like a provincial village, and one that people didn't particularly care for. That changes over time, but that comes later. So within Washington, you had very few public buildings. You also, the roads were unpaved. There were like tons of stories and discussion about traveling to work and just being muddy and dirty by the time that you got there. It was a constant source of frustration when it rained. Part of the roof collapsed in the Capitol building, so things were run down. Right, this was not the epicenter of refinement in art that they envisioned it. And few members few members of Congress wanted to live there. In fact, most kept their normal houses and lived there most of the time. Because it was seen as this rundown, kind of place that everyone complained about. Then there wasn't always the wealth or prestige of being in Congress at this point. Their salary wasn't very high, and many were wealthy, independently wealthy anyway. So they saw this as kind of their civic duty, but then we're, like, we have to debase ourselves to living in this kind of rundown place. In fact, it was very common for people in Congress, to resign in the middle of a session or in their term, when more lucrative jobs came about, and was just kind of expected. So it became available. Jefferson, as far as his characteristics and stuff, there we go. He was a wealthy plantation owner in the South. Although he was less ostentatious than a lot of wealthy plantation owners as far as dress and style. And he intentionally portrayed that. He wanted to give off the image of a plain, ordinary citizen to a degree. He liked that idea and just kind of saw it as his political persona, if you will. He walked to and from his inauguration rather than take the carriage that was given before. Let's see. And intentionally did not dress up. He also didn't really want to in Washington. He actually criticized Hamilton for dressing all frilly and trying to showcase your money, essentially. His political goals, let's see, we can keep that on here. We'll put political goals. His political goals were to remove, oops, there we go, get rid of whatever that was doing there, to remove all Federalists out of power, and obviously put in Republicans in. Specifically, you know, he wanted, he believed in smaller government debt. He actually wanted to pay it off, which then kind of becomes ironic with Louisiana Purchase, which was the biggest purchase in Congress up to that date. So the guy who wanted to limit congressional spending and eliminate the debt then ended up getting put into this position where he had the most expensive purchase out there. He wanted to abolish some internal taxes, and also wanted to reduce the armed forces. So he kind of had this vision of America, which I think fits with the plantation style to a degree. Not that everyone would have plantations, but that this view of America as farmers, as small farmers. Here, we'll put that here. The view, the ideal, right? That the ideal of Americans was, in general, right? Obviously, there would be some plantation owners, but was small. That America in itself was a collective of small farmers, and within that, then, and not large in size. Which again became ironic since he doubled with Louisiana Purchase under his presidency, doubled the size of America. So I mean, that kind of came. He didn't seek that out. That came into being, and it was hard to pass up. With this, then you get the last. We'll put it as E. The midnight appointments. The last standoff between him and Adams. The midnight appointments were exactly as the title. Adams, on his last day as president, made political appointments right up to midnight of his last day as president. So until the last hour of his term. And the reason for this was an attempt to get in as many, he spent the last day furiously appointing people, attempt to get in as many Federalists as possible into these positions, right? Because if then they were appointed, then Jefferson would be stuck with them. So this was totally meant to be like, you know, stick it to Jefferson. One last thing to stick it to Jefferson, and then hope that it balanced out some of the massive shift in Republican control. One of these appointments was William Marbury, and he had been one of those appointments, right? However, what happened is while Adams filled out all the information, because it was at the very end, he did not get the commission, which was the stamp of approval, before Adams left. And what this meant is that you had all the paperwork, but then you had to, the Secretary of State had to like walk it over to get the commission, right? So once Jefferson took over the next day, James Madison became Secretary of State, and it was his job to finalize that appointment. Well, he refused to give Marbury the appointment because they didn't want any more Federalists in. And of course, the argument was as well, Adams didn't finish it. So tough. So what Marbury did is he asked the Supreme Court to require Madison to finish or deliver, right, the appointment. We'll just say finish the appointment. Because what was the connection with this was there was a Judiciary Act of 1789. And the judiciary, this is why he asked the Supreme Court to do this, which said that the Supreme Court had the power to compel executive officials to act in such things as delivering commissions. Right, so he said, based on the Judiciary Act of 1789, please force Madison to finish the appointment. The Supreme Court, why this is important, you know, because if they just said yes, okay, you know, probably wouldn't have made a difference. It would have, maybe would have footnote of how Adams stuck it to Jefferson one last time. Instead, the Supreme Court came back, and the Supreme Court came back and said that they had no authority to order Madison to deliver it. So what was important about this is that not that it didn't get delivered, but what they ruled with this. So they said, okay, so the court has no power to make Madison deliver this because they claimed that Congress overstepped in its bounds in the Constitution with the Judiciary Act. And so because they had said that that they had no right to do that because it stepped the bounds of the Constitution, the Supreme Court changed, I'm going to write Supreme Court here, with this one act, the Supreme Court established a different direction for themselves. They were not originally set up as the arbiters of the Constitution. They were there, right, to enforce interpret the laws that Congress set up. That was their job. Not originally set up to, we'll say, determine if something was constitutional or not. Okay? Their main job was to, we'll say before, their job was to interpret and rule on laws being followed, enacted by Congress. So what is so important about the midnight appointments is that this meant that the Supreme Court gave up a power, which was interpreting and enacting on laws of Congress, and gave themselves a new one. which was that now, instead, their job was to protect the Constitution, to examine laws, to make sure they followed the Constitution, and that they would judge stuff based on whether it was constitutional or not. So this was not what the Supreme Court does now. Is not what the Supreme Court was set up to do. They essentially changed their job title and said, the whole idea of like interpreting the laws of what the laws of Congress meant and enforcing those, that sounds boring. We want to, we're the arbiters of the Constitution. Essentially, the Supreme Court saw themselves as that their main responsibility should actually be determining whether something is constitutional or not and upholding the Constitution. That's the part of that, right? That their job was to uphold the Constitution and make sure that laws were not illegal against the Constitution. This is a much bigger power, right? So they gave up a power, but they got a bigger power in return that they gave themselves, which was not originally what it was designed for, which was now that they were the total and full arbiters of the Constitution. And this is what it is today. That's what the Supreme Court does. You appeal to the Supreme Court, and they decide if they're going to review cases based on whether they think it's an important connection to a constitutional question. And that's whether the decision against you or a court case from the lower courts followed the Constitution, whether a law follows the Constitution or broke the Constitution. They deem whether things are legal or illegal under the Constitution. And that specific power and control came from the midnight appointments. So that's, like I said, that's the larger significance. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at, let's see, is going to be the Louisiana Purchase, which was the big thing with Jefferson. It's probably what he's most remembered for because it was such a huge deal. But the midnight appointments were both an Adams and Jefferson thing, but again, were so important for the definition and structure of the Supreme Court. So Napoleon's in charge of France at this point, right? And we looked at the issues of the Revolutionary War. And he was, like, let's set up just the situation so you understand why he decided to do this and what was going on with that, right? He was at war with most of Europe by this point. Everyone was against, Europe was afraid of Napoleon and was against him. He had original, let's say, initial hopes, initial goals were to also, besides expanding over Europe, create a new world in the Americas, a new French world in the Americas. He was ambitious. He wasn't interested just stopping in Europe. So what kind of kickstarts this whole thing into being is that you had a treaty of San Ildefonso, which was in of 1800 between Spain and France. And this was, it hadn't gone through, but it was going to go through. And what it was going to do is that France would regain the title to Louisiana. And there was also talk of New Orleans. And this, Louisiana was somewhat of the issue, but the largest concern, the U.S. had concern with France having control of New Orleans. And the reason for this was to do with that New Orleans was the main stopping and shipping point for U.S. international trade. And there had been an agreement with Spain for U.S. ships to be able to stop off in New Orleans and use that spot. So even though technically that wasn't U.S. territory, there had been a treaty with Spain that allowed them to do this. And Jefferson took this so seriously, he said, if France should actually take and hold New Orleans, then we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation. That's how serious they took this potential shift in power because of how economically important it was to the U.S. Then on top of this, what happens is that Spain, maybe in preparation for the transfer to France, or whatever, there were some economic reasons for it too, but it probably had a connection to looking to transition it to France. Spain decided to ban American ships in New Orleans, right? This had been going on for years in the use and was part of the treaty. Because of this, and the fear of what this would mean, Jefferson sent Robert Livingston as an ambassador to France, to Paris specifically, to negotiate the purchase of New Orleans, right? They were not looking beyond this. They were looking for, hoping that Napoleon would be willing to sell New Orleans to them so that they could hold on to that port. In the discussion, Napoleon surprised everyone by offering the whole thing. What happened is Livingston decided on his own initiative to suggest that the United States might be interested in purchasing other Louisiana territory. So not just New Orleans, but parts of Louisiana as well, if not all of Louisiana. Not all of the Louisiana Purchase, mind you, that was larger. But so he goes in to ask for New Orleans, but then suggests that the U.S. might be interested in more specifically Louisiana, because that gave some benefit to control that whole area. Napoleon responds by offering the U.S. the entire Louisiana Purchase, right, which was held by France because, again, Napoleon did have these grand plans eventually of making that a French empire, a part of it. So why do this? As was mentioned, you have the United States had started to build up the military in response to Spain banning them and the treaty. The selling of the Louisiana and New Orleans to France. So the buildup was potentially something where Napoleon realized that if the military was going to be building up in the U.S., it was going to make it much harder for him to go in and use that territory, right? It had a specific purpose. He wanted it to be where French would kind of move in and control that territory. But if you have the United States military in controlling the region, it makes it harder. And then his plans for a French America were already failing. So were not going to happen. So because of the situation in France, because of he needed money. They were desperate for money because you had several things. The French military had been not wiped out, but devastated by yellow fever. So he needed to rebuild the military. On top of that, constant war with Europe, because he was expanding and taking over European territories, and they didn't like that. And so he desperately needed the money. And so all of these things played a role in that offer, which shocked and surprised. They were super surprised by that offer. They had to decide, James Monroe was there as well. They had to decide quickly if they were going to accept it. Because they said, technically the law, they couldn't just accept it. Technically, right? Congress had to approve purchase before they accept. So they told Napoleon this and said, hey, wow. Oh, and by the way, it was for, they negotiated, but the negotiating price became $15 million, which was an insane deal for all of the Louisiana territory. Not just territory, all the Louisiana Purchase, which was beyond the Louisiana Territory, and New Orleans. This was amazing deal. And like what they were willing to pay for New Orleans was, the New Orleans itself was not more than 15 million, but like it wasn't, I forget exactly how much it was, but like they were willing to pay it for New Orleans, and then he's saying, but I'll just give you all this territory for just a little bit more money. And so they said, hey, yeah, this is amazing. We're interested, we want it, but here's the thing, we have to go back to Congress first and have them approve it, and then we can do it. And Napoleon was like, oh, here's the deal. You can buy it, you can accept it now, or I'll go see if someone else wants to purchase it. And they're like, oh, no, please don't, that'll probably be like the worst option is to sell it to the British. And all of a sudden the British are back in controlling massive territory in the US or in the region. And so they're like, no, okay, fine, we'll buy it. So they agreed right there on the spot they, like I said, they did haggle it down to 15 million. That became the agreed price, but it doubled the size of the US. So they agreed to purchase it illegally, right? Basically, illegally. It was not a legal purchase. We'll say illegal purchase. And they had to get Congress to approve after the fact. Although it wasn't super hard because of the fact that it doubled the size of the US. So they did. And this eventually took shape in the Northwest Territory, which they assumed would then come in as states, with Louisiana being the first to do so in 1812. The other consequence of this, besides doubling the size of, let's see, what are we on? E. Besides doubling the size of the U.S., the other consequence was that, well, one, it prevented French expansion or British or someone else's. But then you have a huge impetus for exploring the West. There was already some plan to do so with expeditions by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, who had been commissioned by Jefferson. What their intended goal was to cross the continent, which was not all U.S. territory, and make it to Pacific coast. Along the way, then they were to, catalog everything and anything. Maps, people, that they ran into, languages, trade that they could potentially use the Native Americans and things like that. This became more public and of interest after Louisiana Purchase. And they recorded, they had journals that detailed the whole thing. I'll say expedition. One of the more famous aspects of that was they met a French fur trader whose wife was Native American, and her name was Sacagawea, and she became their translator and guide. And really, they only were successful because she was around. The end result of this was that it was clear that it was possible by land to cross the American continent. Once it's done, and now you had all this new territory that was purchased with the Louisiana Purchase, right? And so with the Lewis and Clark expedition and the new purchase, it created justification for westward expansion, which this kick started off, and you have massive westward expansion for all the new territory and the potential of land, and the idea of manifest destiny, that it was the God-given right and destiny of Americans to spread out from coast to coast. This eventually is also going to lead to the Homestead Acts and land giveaways, the Oklahoma land rush, and all of that, where you have just mass movement west. But it definitely got coupled and tied to the idea of justification and manifest destiny, because of this, kind of like basically we got all this property that just got planted in our laps, and then we have the Lewis and Clark expedition that shows it's possible, and all of this stuff that's available and out there. Clearly God has established that this is what we're supposed to do. Of course, also the economic fuel and desire to expand. This is going to also lead to the Indian Removal Act, as people begin to more and more push for expansion. And then now you have all this other, Midwest territory that you can remove the Native Americans to, because you want the land that's remaining from the tribal land in the East. So that's where we're going to end. We look at the Market Revolution next, and then, after that will be Andrew Jackson and the Indian Removal Act.